This video addresses a sensitive subject, Germanwings Flight 9525. There is a discrepancy between the final accident report and the documentation collected during the investigation. This is the story of how an investigation was shaped and ultimately compromised by a single assumption. Hello aviators, how are you today? My name is Magnar Nordal. I'm a retired airline captain. When an aviation accident occurs, it is natural for the public to seek quick answers. However, most aviation accidents result from a chain of events, and only a thorough and methodological investigation can establish the facts. This takes time. It is also essential to respect the principle that a person is innocent until proven guilty beyond reasonable doubt. This is especially important when the individual involved cannot defend themselves. On the 4th of November 2025, UPS Flight 2976 crashed shortly after takeoff. 2 days later, the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, held a press briefing. The spokesperson presented the facts known at the time and then said the following.
Now, let me tell you a little bit about our process at the NTSB. What we will do is analyze the facts, determine the probable cause of this accident, and then issue a report on those recommendations.
In a discussion of the same accident, retired investigator Germanwings said, "It is very easy, even on a professional investigation team, to start out with assumptions and then try to find data that support that assumption." This observation is highly relevant to Germanwings Flight 9525, an Airbus A320 that crashed in the French Alps on 26 March 2015, killing all 150 people on board. Just 2 days after the crash, Marseille State Attorney Brice Robin held a press conference where he declared the co-pilot had deliberately flown the aircraft into the ground while alone in the cockpit. At that time, the investigation had barely begun. Because the event was treated as a suspected act of mass murder, it was investigated by the Investigate Court of Marseille, France, and the State Attorney's Office in Düsseldorf, Germany. Together, they produced more than 20,000 pages of material, including witness interviews, medical records for forensic analysis, and transcript from the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder. With the assistance of Simon Radecki, editor of the Aviation Herald, I was granted access to these documents. In this video, I will show that they contradict the main conclusion of the final report of the Bureau of Enquiry and Analysis of Civil Aviation Safety, BEA. Before reacting, I ask you to watch the video to the end. What follows is not speculation or conspiracy theory. I will present the investigation documents and compare them directly with the BEA report, allowing you to draw your own conclusions. The first question I will address is this: did the co-pilot suffer from a mental disorder? The BEA's final report is 110 pages long, with about 60 pages devoted to mental health. On page 30, it states that in August 2008, the co-pilot suffered a severe depressive episode without psychotic symptoms, entered no suicide pacts with a psychiatrist, and was hospitalized. He received antidepressant medication from January to July 2009 and psychotherapeutic treatment from January to October 2009. His treating psychiatrist stated he had fully recovered by July 2009. While most of this information is correct, the claim that he was hospitalized is not. In his Class 1 medical application dated 24 February 2010, yes is ticked for admission to hospital, but the remarks read 126 TE, meaning tonsillectomy, removal of his tonsils, which occurred when he was 4 years old. The form also marks yes for psychological disorder with the remark Engineous Depression 2009. His aviation medical certificate was issued on 28th of July 2009 and was revalidated regularly in the following years. In December 2014, the co-pilot reportedly experienced vision problems and sleep disturbances. He consulted several specialists, all of whom found no organic cause, meaning the symptoms could not be explained by physical findings. On page 33 of the final report, it is written, "The limited medical and personal data available to the safety investigation did not make it possible for an ambiguous psychiatric diagnosis to be made. In particular, an interview with the co-pilot's relatives and his private physicians was impossible, as they exercised their right to refuse to be interviewed by the BEA and/or the BFU, the German Aviation Accident Investigation Bureau. However, the majority of the team of experts consulted by the BEA agreed that the limited medical information available may be consistent with the co-pilot having suffered from a psychotic depressive episode that started in December 2014, which lasted until the day of the accident. In my view, phrases such as did not make it possible and may be do not constitute proof beyond reasonable doubt. The Düsseldorf files include an interview with a captain who flew with a co-pilot the day before the accident. Neither he nor others interviewed by the police reported any unusual behavior. On the contrary, they had a positive impression of him. The co-pilot and his girlfriend were planning to start a family. The final report does not mention that 2 psychiatric assessments were carried out in the weeks preceding the accident. On the 29th of January 2015, the same psychiatrist who had previously treated the co-pilot issued a specialist medical certificate stating, quote, "In my opinion, from a psychiatric point of view, the patient is completely healthy. There is no indication whatsoever of any illness within the psychiatric spectrum. Mr. NN does not, with regard to psychiatric illness, carry a higher risk than the average of the population." This document is missing in the final report from the BEA. On the 17th of February 2015, a general practitioner diagnosed the co-pilot with psychosomatic symptom complex, visual disturbances somatically ruled out, referring him to psychotherapy. On 24th of February 2015, the co-pilot was examined by a psychiatrist and was prescribed an antidepressant along with medication to assist with sleep. On the 10th of March 2015, the same general practitioner referred him to a day treatment in a psychiatric clinic. On the 16th of March 2015, just 8 days before the crash, the co-pilot saw the same psychiatrist. The patient journal reads, "Diagnosed ICD F45.0V, somatization disorder, and ICD F51.0G, non-organic insomnia. Letter V stands for Verdacht, suspicion. Letter G stands for gesichert, verified. Findings: alert, all-round oriented patient, formally restricted vision but distractible, restlessness, tension, nervousness, brooding, no delusions, no sensory illusions, no compulsion, mild anxiety, undisturbed drive, no withdrawal, sleep with ESS, disturbance of falling asleep, and DSS, disturbance of remaining asleep. No suicidal tendencies." This was also missing in the final report. So the BEA's final report treats the general practitioner's suspicion as a confirmed diagnosis while omitting the psychiatrist, the only one qualified to make such a diagnosis. On page 33 of the BEA's final report, it is stated, Toxicological examinations of the co-pilot's human tissue found at the accident site were conducted by the French judicial authorities. The presence of citalopram and mirtazapine, which are two antidepressant medications, as well as Sulpiclone, which is a sleeping aid medication, was detected. The final report does not mention that the hair samples were analyzed in the laboratory. The laboratory detected mirtazapine, citalopram, and Sulpiclone in all the hair strands, but not in the hair roots. The concentrations found were significantly lower than would be expected during regular daily use of these medications. Tissue samples were also analyzed. Sulpiclone was not detected, while mirtazapine and citalopram were present in very small amounts. The laboratory summarized the findings with the following conclusion. At the time of death, Mr. NN very likely had antidepressants present in non-toxic concentrations. It is impossible to determine whether the circulating blood concentrations were within the therapeutic range, and therefore it is impossible to determine whether the antidepressants were effective shortly before death or not. Thus, there was no evidence that the co-pilot was under the influence of those medications while he was on active duty. Despite this documentation, Düsseldorf public prosecutor Christoph Kumpa remained convinced that the co-pilot had deliberately crashed the aircraft. It should be noted that no medical experts or CRM specialists were consulted during the analysis of the cockpit voice recorder, CVR. Furthermore, no individuals who personally knew the co-pilot, neither family members nor colleagues, were involved in identifying the voices on the cockpit voice recorder. In 2024, Kumpa was asked why, and he replied in an email, quote, "The co-pilot's medical records were assessed by the undersigned. There were no need to consult experts in this respect. The undersigned had sufficient expertise on his own as a long-standing department head for capital criminal cases, death investigation proceedings, and medical malpractice proceedings. There was no reason to verify the data." This raises a fundamental question. If the co-pilot was not mentally ill, then what caused the aircraft to crash? And who was actually in the cockpit at that time? The criminal investigation files contain two cockpit voice recorder, CVR, transcripts covering the final 30 minutes of the flight. One transcript in German has all conversations redacted. The other, in French, has partial redactions and omits certain cockpit sounds. A CVR in transport aircraft records 4 channels. Channel 1 captures the captain's headset audio, distinguishing between microphone input and headset audio. Channel 2 records the co-pilot's headset. Channel 3 records the observer's headset and the public address system. And Channel 4 records the cockpit area microphone. The documentation confirms that the accident aircraft CVR followed this standard configuration. However, a report from the French Gendarmerie Aviation Unit, translated into German, states, Track 1 contains the last 30 minutes of high quality from the co-pilot's headset. Track 2 contains the last 30 minutes in high quality from the captain's headset. Every pilot and aviation engineer knows that this configuration is not possible. In another document, also originating from the French Gendarmerie Aviation Unit and translated into German, it is stated, based on the factual findings gathered during this work, we can assume that the strong voice captured on the various tracks is that of the flight's captain. This is critical because, according to the cockpit voice recorder transcript, it is the pilot recorded on channel 2 who leaves the cockpit. Before proceeding, it is important to clarify that the captain is not suspected of any wrongdoing. There were other factors that resulted in the accident. First, however, let us look at the transcript from the cockpit voice recorder. As I mentioned before, there are two transcripts from the cockpit voice recorder. The account presented here combines material from both. The left side is the transcript as recorded by the BEA and published by the investigators. The right side is my interpretation and translation. You can freeze the video and study each page if you want. At the start of the recording, the dialogue is in German, which I have translated into English. After 6 minutes, the transcript switches to French, indicating it was translated from German. I have rendered this section into English as well, with the understanding that some nuances of the original may have been lost in translation. The transcript begins at 09, 10, 12 seconds. 3 asterisks indicate the conversation is redacted. The label 12_ATC indicates that air traffic control, ATC, is transmitting over the radio, and this audio is heard in both pilots' headsets. 1 is the captain's headset, and 2 is the co-pilot's headset. The next line, 12_XH1, indicates that the captain is speaking into the microphone of his headset, and the audio is received in both headsets. 124_XH2 indicates the co-pilot is speaking into his microphone. In addition to the headsets, this audio is also captured by the cockpit area microphone, channel 4. At the start of the recording, the pilots discuss the flight route. Then they move on to talk about the schedule for the following day. At 09:12:15, the cockpit door buzzer sounded. This buzzer is activated when someone in the cabin enters a code on the cockpit door panel. According to the Flight Crew Operating Manual, FCOM, the buzzer can be set to sound for 1 to 9 seconds. In this case, it was set for 1 second, which is documented in the final report. I will come back to that. The cockpit door is reinforced to resist any forced entry, and a video camera allows the pilots to see who is outside before they unlock the door. The door is unlocked by moving the cockpit door switch to the unlock position. When set to lock, the door is secured and the buzzer and keypad are disabled. At 09:12:20, the cockpit door opened and a cabin attendant entered. At 09:15:53, the cockpit door opened again and the cabin attendant left the cockpit. At 09:15:58, Barcelona Air Traffic Control instructed the crew to contact Marseille. The call sign was Germanwings 18 Golf. Since the co-pilot was handling radio communications, we know he was acting as pilot monitoring, PM. Therefore, the captain was pilot flying, PF. The co-pilot contacted Marseille, reporting they were passing flight level 290, that is 29,000 feet pressure altitude, and climbing to flight level 300. From 09:16:53, the conversation is written in French, indicating it was translated from German. The transcript contains numerous briefing sounds and unidentified mechanical sounds. The cockpit environment is noisy due to cooling fans, air vents, and general airflow. As a result, not every sound can be precisely identified. Even a ball pen can produce an unknown sound. At 09:19:04, the flight was cleared to climb to flight level 380. At 09:21:40, the pilots discussed the delayed departure from Barcelona, which appears to have involved ramp handling. At 09:29:39, they handed over to another frequency and cleared direct to the Irmar waypoint, which the co-pilot reads back. At 09:30:08, the co-pilot says, "Jetzt gehe ich mal weg." Yeah? I just go for a moment, okay? Dein Funk, your radio. The captain replies, Mein Funk, my radio. The co-pilot then removes his headset, releases his seatbelt, and activates the seat's electrical motion. The captain operates the cockpit door toggle switch to open the door. Most of those actions are recorded as impulsive sound or unknown sound, although the sound of the seat movement is marked with a question mark. At 09:30:27, the cockpit door is closed. From this point onward, I have used both transcripts as they together provide a better picture. From 09:31:16, the captain made 4 exhalations in 9.2 seconds. That is 26 per minute. From 09:32:40, the captain made 32 exhalations in 1 minute, 3 seconds. That is 30 per minute. A person at rest normally breathes 12 to 20 times per minute. An excessively high breathing rate can eventually lead to loss of consciousness, but there must be an underlying medical cause. I will discuss 3 possible scenarios, starting with carbon monoxide, CO, poisoning. There have been several incidents in which flight crews were exposed to fumes from the air conditioning system, causing elevated CO levels in the blood. This lowered oxygen levels and triggered faster breathing. Here is a list of some of the incidents. 2. Cardiovascular disease, such as heart disease or stroke, which restricts blood flow to the heart or brain and often causes faster breathing. 3. A seizure or epileptic seizure, which can occur suddenly. I know this personally. A few years ago, my brother, with no history of epilepsy, had a seizure triggered by a brain tumor pressing on a blood vessel in his brain. The tumor was removed and he fully recovered. A similar incident occurred with a Lufthansa pilot in 2024, which I will discuss later. These are 3 possible explanations for why the captain may have lost consciousness and could no longer respond to sounds. Other causes are possible, but the key point is that acute medical emergencies can occur. In this document, the French National Gendarmerie for Air Transport states, listening to the various recording channels revealed that breathing could be heard via the mouth microphones, which means that he was alive, although it was not possible to prove whether he was also conscious. Back to the cockpit voice recorder. At 09:30:53, I have inserted information from the flight data recorder, FDR. According to page 13 in the final report, at 09:30:53, the selected altitude on the flight control unit, FCU, changed in 1 second from 38,000 feet to 100 feet. 1 second later, the autopilot switched to open descent mode and the autothrust changed to throttle idle mode. The airplane began to descend. At 09:33:47, Marseille ATC noticed that the aircraft was descending and attempted to contact the flight. At 09:34:30, the cockpit buzzer sounded for 1.1 seconds, accompanied by an unknown impulsive noise. This is discussed on page 35 in the final report. It states that the buzzer sounded for 980 milliseconds, which is consistent with previous recordings of the buzzer. An accompanying clacking noise could not be identified. The report notes, the clacking noise did not end the buzzer, as an action on the cockpit door toggle switch would. In addition, the noise was significantly louder than a switch activation. On page 36, the report further states, therefore, the possibility that it corresponds of an emergency access request cancelled after 980 milliseconds by an action on the toggle switch is considered to be extremely remote. In other words, this was a routine request to open the cockpit door. Note, this was the only time the door buzzer sounded. At 09:35:03, the intercom buzzer sounded. To respond, the pilot would simply need to speak into the microphone of his headset. At 09:35:32, 6 knocks were heard on the cockpit door. At 09:36:04, the intercom buzzer sounded again, followed by 5 knocks on the door. At 09:37:11, 5 more knocks occurred, accompanied by the voice of a man. At 09:37:47, 7 strong knocks were heard, and the knocking continued with the increasing intensity. At 09:40:41, the ground proximity warning system detected that the aircraft was close to the ground and began issuing oral terrain and pull-up alerts. The recording ended at 09:41:04. The Airbus A330 Flight Crew Operating Manual, FCOM, includes a section on the cockpit door. Here we can read that outside the cockpit is a keypad with a numeric display and 3 LED lights. When you enter a code of up to 7 digits followed by the hashtag, a buzzer sounds in the cockpit for a preset time of 1 to 9 seconds. In the accident aircraft, the time was set to 1 second. To unlock the door, the flight crew must move the toggle switch on the cockpit door panel to unlock. If the toggle switch is set to lock, the buzzer is silenced, and the keypad is inhibited for a preset time of 5 to 20 minutes. If the flight crew do not respond, you can enter an emergency code of up to 7 digits, causing the buzzer to sound continuously for a preset time of 15 to 120 seconds. If the toggle switch of the cockpit door panel is not moved, the door automatically unlocks for 5 seconds, allowing access to the cockpit. The transcript shows that the cockpit door buzzer sounded only once, and for just 1 second, or 980 milliseconds to be exact. This indicates that the emergency code on Germanwings Flight 9525 was never used. A similar situation occurred on Lufthansa Flight 1140 on 17 February 2024, when the co-pilot became incapacitated while alone on the flight deck. According to investigation report, just 36 seconds after the captain left the cockpit to use the lavatory, the co-pilot experienced a seizure. The seizure caused the pilot to inadvertently operate switches and make flight control inputs. However, the autopilot remained engaged, and the flight director modes were not changed. The first officer remained unconscious for approximately 10 minutes. When the captain returned from the lavatory, we used the standard entry procedure to access the flight deck. There was no response from the cockpit. The captain made 3 further attempts, and a member of the cabin crew made an intercom call to the flight deck. There was no response, so the captain used the emergency access code. Before the emergency access code time expired, the co-pilot regained consciousness and opened the flight deck door manually. Could a similar scenario have occurred on Germanwings Flight 9525? More importantly, why didn't the co-pilot use the emergency code? The cockpit voice recorder transcript shows only a single activation of the cockpit buzzer, lasting just 1 second, or 980 milliseconds to be precise. According to the accident report, there is no evidence that access to the cockpit was denied by selecting the toggle switch to the lock position. To explain why the emergency code was not used, I must rely on oral accounts, as no written documentation is available. A few days before the accident, the same aircraft reportedly experienced an unusual incident. During a ground stop, both pilots left the cockpit, and the door closed behind them. They were unable to reopen the door, even by entering the emergency code, and a technician was required to unlock it. According to the reports, the number 2 key on the keypad was inoperative. It is unclear whether this malfunction was recorded in the aircraft's technical log. Had the crew of Flight 9525 been aware that the keypad was partially inoperative, they would have been expected to follow the procedure in the minimum equipment list, which requires at least 2 people remain in the cockpit at all times. It is also worth noting that, at the time of the accident, Germanwings did not have a procedure in place to test the emergency code on a daily basis. According to page 13 on the BEA final report, the selected altitude on the Flight Control Unit, FCU, changed from 38,000 feet to 100 feet within 1 second. The aircraft then began descending in open descent mode. The FCU is located on a glare shield and interfaces with 2 flight management and guidance computers, FMGC1 and 2. The FMGCs generate commands for autopilot, flight director, and auto thrust systems. They operate independently, each controlling one autopilot, AP1 and AP2. Importantly, the FCU and FMGCs exchange information in both directions, meaning an FMGC can change indications displayed on the FCU. On the 19th of March 2017, a Germanwings Airbus A319 experienced several uncommanded autopilot mode changes and 2 uncommanded descents, all corrected by the crew. Following that incident, Airbus recommended replacing FMGC1, confirming that such mode changes can be initiated by the FMGC. There have been other Airbus incidents in which automation malfunctions caused in-flight upsets and injuries to passengers and cabin crew. The most serious occurred on 7 October 2008, when a Qantas Airbus A330 experienced sudden uncommanded pitch-down events after an Air Data Inertial Reference Unit transmitted intermittent aeronomous data, prompting the flight control computers to command nose-down inputs. As a result, 119 people were injured. The most recent incident occurred on 30 October 2025, when a JetBlue Airbus A320 suddenly pitched down, injuring several people. Preliminary investigations traced the event to the elevator and aileron computer. Investigators determined that intense solar or cosmic radiation at cruising altitude can cause data corruption, known as single event upsets or particle-induced bit flips, in certain software versions, potentially leading to autonomous control commands. As a result, approximately 6,000 aircraft were grounded until the affected software was updated. Returning to Germanwings Flight 9525, the final report states that the selected altitude of the FCU dropped from 38,000 feet to 100 feet within 1 second. The flight data recorder logs data at 1 second intervals, but this raises an important question. How long would it actually take a person to manually select 100 feet, the lowest selectable altitude? So I checked it out. Attempt 1 took 0.70 seconds. And attempt 2 took 0.80 seconds. However, because the flight data recorder records only once per second, and the pilot cannot know the exact sampling moment, data captured during mid-rotation will show intermediate values across several samples. This makes it unlikely that the altitude will be recorded as exactly 100 feet within the narrow window between 2 flight data recorder samplings. This specific sequence, where the selected altitude dropped from 38,000 feet to 100 feet with the blink of an eye, was reproduced in an Airbus A320 simulator using an FCU previously installed in an operational aircraft. This clip appears in a Sky documentary about the incident. On page 28, the final report includes a graph showing variations in selected altitude during the earlier Düsseldorf to Barcelona flight, when the first officer was alone in the cockpit. Later, on page 86, the report states that actions on the autopilot system during the first flight of the day may be interpreted as a rehearsal for suicide. The enlarged graph with a resolution of 10 pixels per second allows detailed second-by-second analysis. At 07:20:29, the aircraft was instructed to descend from flight level 370 to flight level 350, a routine change requiring only 2 clicks on the altitude selector. The selected altitude then dropped from 35,000 feet to 100 feet within 1 second. While demanding, this is still possible with deliberately rapid human input. Shortly afterward, the altitude increased in 2 steps to 49,000 feet, the system maximum, then dropped to a low value before being reset to 35,000 feet. The entire sequence took about 3 seconds and is consistent with human action. I replicated a similar sequence in 3.3 seconds. At 07:21:10, the flight was cleared to descend to flight level 210. The time to set the altitude clearly reflects human input. The altitude then dropped from 21,000 feet to 100 feet within 1 second. The altitude then jumped from 100 feet back to 21,000 feet within 1 second. While technically possible, this is extremely difficult. My attempts range from 2.5 seconds to a minimum of 1.0 seconds. Shortly after, the altitude again dropped from 21,000 feet to 100 feet and was reset to 25,000 feet, overshooting in the process, clearly indicating human input. Whether this was an error made by the co-pilot or a new clearance to flight level 250 remains unknown. Next, the altitude fell from 25,000 feet to 100 feet and then jumped back to 25,000. I was able to replicate this only once in 0.5 seconds with a lucky attempt. To sum it up, the graph shows 4 deliberate human actions, but the rapid jumps from 100 feet to 21,000 feet and from 100 feet to 25,000 feet within a single second are nearly impossible for a human. Given the 2017 incident that led Airbus to recommend replacing a flight management and guidance computer, and numerous other automation-related events, it is clear that computer failures can occur. To sum it up, I have never seen a case where the available evidence so clearly contradicts the conclusions of an official accident report. ICAO Annex 13 requires investigation authorities, such as the BEA, to operate independently and to first gather factual information, then analyze it, and only afterwards draw conclusions. In this case, however, it appears that the conclusion was reached before the investigation began, and the subsequent process followed that assumption rather than the evidence. The investigation documentation established the following facts. 1. The co-pilot did not have any mental disorder. 2. The co-pilot was not under influence of medication, drugs, alcohol, or any similar substances during the accident flight. 3. The co-pilot was the one who left the cockpit. 4. The cockpit door emergency code was never activated. Furthermore, it is plausible that the captain was unconscious, and it is plausible that the aircraft entered a descent without pilot input, a scenario that has occurred in other incidents. I could have gone into many other details, such as the iPad that didn't belong to the co-pilot, or the 72 work orders entered into the aircraft's electronic technical log on the day of the accident. However, this video is already long enough. So, what do you think? Should the BEA reopen the investigation and take a fresh independent look? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. As always, a big thank you to the members supporting this channel. Thank you for watching.